This thing. Yeah. Hey everyone. Okay, we're gonna get started in a couple minutes with Global History Night. Here's Wayne Goodman. He's gonna be talking with us about a lot of really interesting stuff. So I will see you guys in just a minute. Never hated on the nigga, what they hate me for. Said I wasn't gonna stop when I stepped in the door. So I'ma hold on to this game till my hands get so. I got a line in my pocket. Never hated on the nigga, what they hate me for. Said I wasn't gonna stop when I stepped in the door. So I'ma hold on to this game till my hands get so.
Alright, 17 seconds. That's the monitor. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Hey, everybody. Global History Night. We're here with Wayne and DJ Rowe, and we're going to get right into it because politics to get to later on. So I invited Wayne Goodman here after hearing a talk he did at the JFK Library. Would you describe yourself as a writer?
I would like to think I'm a writer.
I think
yes.
so. Author, creator, organizer. Wayne does a podcast and he organizes really cool readings called Queer Words and just a whole lot of stuff. And one of my particular interests is gay historical fiction that Wayne is creating. And so that is what we're going to be talking about. That's what we're going to be starting off talking about. And do you speak Russian?
Malinki, Porushki.
Wow.
Da.
Wow. How did you learn Russian?
Well, how does everybody learn Russian?
I don't know. I don't know Russian.
I don't know. How did I? I don't remember.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by languages.
Yeah.
I wrote a musical based on the Gorbachevs.
Oh, wow.
In the 90s. And while I was doing that, I wanted to have them speak or sing Russian.
Yeah.
So I learned more Russian at that time.
Wow. Was it performed?
Oh, yes, a couple of times.
Oh, my God. See,
I have it up on YouTube.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's called Wife of the Party.
Okay. So what did you find interesting? Okay, so audience, you want to give a little bit of background about the Gorbachevs?
Well, sure. Mikhail Gorbachev was the last general secretary of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And when he came to power in 1985, he and his wife Raisa wanted to bring the Soviet Union more in line with the rest of the world. And so they began a series of reforms, hoping that it would benefit the people. They started with perestroika was the openness,
yeah.
And they started some reforms and let people speak.
Yeah.
And what happened was the people spoke up about them. They
Mm-hmm.
trashed the Gorbachevs,
mm-hmm.
and with their newfound power of speech. And then in 1991, they went to a vacation home and were promptly put under house arrest while a coup attempt was going on in Moscow. And that's the setting for my musical history, where they start by going to the dacha because they think they're going for vacation, and then they're under house arrest. And initially, I wanted to tell the story of Raisa because mm-hmm. I found her an incredible woman, someone who was near one of the most powerful men in history.
What was her background?
She was a doctorate. She was from the sticks out in the backwoods of Soviet Union.
Yeah, so the sticks, would that be the I mean,
yes.
Oh my God, the sticks.
Out in the backwoods, yes.
Yeah.
And her father had worked with Stalin, and Stalin did not like Raisa's father and sent him to the gulags where he eventually died. Raisa went to Moscow, to university, and that's where she met Mikhail Gorbachev. And the two of them started hanging out together. He just wanted to be a lawyer. He was from Crimea. He was from the country.
Was this in the 50s?
Yes, yes, late 40s, early 50s when they met. And so they got married, and he rose up in party politics. My idea is that she pushed him. My concept is he just wanted to be a country lawyer.
Yeah.
She had bigger ideas. So my vision in Wife of the Party is it's Riza who pushed and pushed and pushed them up the ladder to get to a point where they had the power. Then she could say, well, now let's do something for the people.
Wow, because of her father being sent away. And
She had a score to settle with Stalin. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
So that was the basis for that.
Okay. So how did you? And so, are you? So do you consider yourself a composer too?
Yes, I do. I composed all the music.
Oh wow! And you play the piano?
Yes.
Okay.
I do everything. What can I say?
Seriously.
I couldn't play Riza though.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So how many acts is it?
It's a 2-act.
And how did you find people to play the roles?
Well, one of my closest friends is the only person who's ever played the role of Riza. And the role of Mikhail, there's only 2 roles, it's just the 2 of them, was another good friend whom we had both worked with. And then I chose another person to do it for a later performance. The one that's actually on YouTube is done by somebody who looks more like Gorbachev.
So it was like a so it's a 2-person thing. Is it inspired? But what inspires you musically?
I'm not sure.
Or theatrically.
Well, I wanted to portray Riza's struggle to be something.
Yeah.
To rise up from nothing, to be something, and then to try to make things better and to be shot down. Talk about ourselves and how we met, and so that's what they use to stay calm while there's stuff going on outside. They're telling each other their story of how they met and rose up in the party. Okay.
So yeah, because when I heard you speak at the library, you were talking about, I was really interested in the Russian stuff you were talking about. So do you want to talk about your books?
Sure, I can always talk about my books.
Okay.
Well, most of what I write is historical fiction.
Yeah.
And the very first book I want to talk about came from a very strange place. About 20 years ago, this idea popped into my head. I thought, what if Jackie Kennedy was pregnant the day JFK was shot? I have no idea where the thought came from, but it popped into my head. And that night, my partner at the time and I took my mother out for Mother's Day. And I brought this up at dinner. I said, hey, if there was such a kid, what do you think that person would look like now? And we played with the idea and tried to come up with a worst case scenario and had some fun with it. Well, within a week, I was near death. A disease took me down. And the recovery period was nearly a month. I thought I was going to die. It was really horrible. But I was coming back slowly, and I needed something to motivate me to move forward, and I thought a project is a good idea. So this idea about the Kennedy child popped into my mind, and I thought, oh, I'll turn this into a book. So I started thinking about characters and whatnot, and then I realized I'd like it to be from the viewpoint of a Secret Service agent who was at Dallas when Kennedy was shot.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And in the current time of the book, he's dealing with coming out issues in his 60s because he's now retired, gone back to his small little town in rural Indiana.
Yeah.
Let me get that.
Sure. Wow.
And that is The Last Great Hope.
The Last Great Hope. And where are your books available?
Well, print books are at your local bookstore,
local bookstores.
But all of these books are ebooks.
Yeah.
And they're available on all platforms, not just the big one that people don't like to talk about. I use a service that distributes through all things like Nook, Barnes & Noble, iBooks, Apple Books. So the ebooks are available just about everywhere online you'd find ebooks. And some of the books are audiobooks.
Okay.
This is also audiobook. I do my own audio, so you get to hear my voice.
Oh my God. Okay.
Well,
okay, yeah, everybody, because you're all loving Wayne so
fun.
much, you can hear Wayne
Yeah. Well,
all the time.
It's fun because I get to act out all the parts.
Yeah. Oh, that is so cool.
So,
Okay.
so this tells the story of this gentleman in his 60s who was a Secret Service agent and was given the task of hiding this baby. He had no idea who it was. They were adopting it out under assumed name in 1964. And then years later, all of a sudden, his boss, his old boss, gets in touch with him and says that he needs to go find this baby with almost no clues. And he ends up in San Francisco in 2002. And it's interesting because I wrote about a lot of things that are no longer there,
Well, yeah.
including the town of Paradise. The story takes these people to the town of Paradise, which is now no longer there. It burnt down earlier this year.
Paradise?
Yeah.
You know the one that burnt down, PG&E?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So there's a couple of chapters in this book that take place in a town that no longer exists.
Wow.
So it's kind of a little memory lane
yeah,
kind of thing.
that's a real. I know.
Oh, okay.
It happens.
Okay.
That's a real piece of history.
So this is my first historic. Well, it's sort of historical. It's based on history, but it's funny. When I wrote it, it took place in the future.
Yeah.
Now it takes place in the past
Oh my
with
God.
stuff that doesn't even exist anymore.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Well,
Wow.
thank you. So one of the other things that I'm really interested in is British history.
Yeah.
I find that I know more about British history than many people who were born in England.
Yeah.
And I was reading a book about Queen Victoria, and the author so kindly started with a story about a cousin of hers named Charlotte, who was born before Victoria but died before. And Charlotte would have been queen if she had lived. And she had an amazing life. This woman was friends with Jane Austen.
Mm-hmm.
She knew a lot of people. Everybody was looking for her to be queen. She was forthright. Her father chose a husband for her. She said, no, not him. I'm going to go with that guy.
Mm-hmm.
And she chose her own husband. I like to say if she had lived to be queen, women's rights would be 50 to 75 years ahead of where they are now.
Like that.
So I was so thrilled with her story. I went and got every book I could find about her. All the books were written about her. And I wanted to have a book that was her, that gave you a sense of who she was. And so I wrote Britain's Glory. And it's not just about her. It gives you an idea of, first of all, why she was born. She was born because her father needed extra money. It's really sad to say, but the only reason that she was born is that when her father approached the prime minister for extra money to help pay off his loans, the prime minister basically said, you don't have an heir. If you had an heir, maybe we could give you some more money.
Wow.
And so he got a wife whom he never liked,
Yeah.
had a child whom he never cared for, and she grew up
And
to be...
he probably wanted her to be a boy too.
That
Just 'cause they were like that.
He was so disinterested.
Really?
As long as he
Wouldn't
had his
even
money.
care?
Oh no, I don't think
That
he
is
really
weird.
cared.
Yeah.
So this is her story, but I call it dramatized history because
Yeah.
it's more told in vignettes. It's people talking to each other, and I find it much more alive than just she did this and then she did this. It's all in there, but they talk about it or they're doing things while you find out.
So when you make decisions about dialogue, because that must be a real, I mean, that's a big thing to take on because you don't want to necessarily make it exactly how they would have talked back then, but you don't want them to be like, oh, hey, what's up? I mean...
No, it is a fine line.
Yeah.
In fact, when I first put the book up on ebooks, I was challenged because I used the word okay. And somebody wrote and said, that word did not exist in 1820 when this person used it. And I went and looked it up and I go, oh my gosh, yes, it didn't come into common usage until about 1850. So when I write now, if I use a word that is a little bit out of common usage, I will look to make sure it existed in time and history.
I didn't know okay was used in the 1850s.
It started around 1830, but it became more common usage
Wow.
in 1850s.
I thought it was even later.
Yeah. So I try to cover my tracks now when I use words to make sure. A really good example of this is the word gobsmacked. Everybody knows gobsmacked. It's been used in Harry Potter.
Yeah.
People think, oh, it's this old British word. No, it's 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
So people in the 19th century would not use the phrase gobsmacked.
Yeah.
So I had to take that out when I wrote 19th century stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Britain's Glory is an amazing story about an amazing woman, and I just wish we had her more in our consciousness. I dedicated the book to the new Princess Charlotte.
Oh, Princess Charlotte.
Yes, and I
She's
hope
so cute.
I hope she has as fabulous but much longer life.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh God, Princess Charlotte's adorable. It could be great if she comes across it one of these days.
I sent someone a message about it, or I sent them a copy or something.
Yeah.
I tried to. I never got a response though.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of these days.
I would like to have a BBC version of this, but they don't take scripts from people who aren't natural-born British citizens.
Really?
Wow, I didn't
So
know that.
yeah. So don't be sending your scripts into BBC.
Okay.
Wow, that's
So.
interesting. Natural born. You have to be.
You have to be a
born,
British
like what-
citizen to send scripts to BBC.
but not just naturally.
Well,
born.
I might
A
that. You have to be a British citizen.
citizen. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, that is fascinating.
Yeah.
So okay, Princess Charlotte. Okay, now we got the seed of
Oh
immortality.
yes. Well.
Okay.
Seed of
Uh-oh.
Immortality.
Here's a little cackle.
Well, this is an unusual book, I will say. I have a partner whose name is Rick, and about 5 years ago, I took him to meet my mother. My mother likes to play the game of mahjong. I don't know if you've ever seen the little tiles.
Yeah.
These things, these
Yeah.
little tiles, and he thought it was a lot of fun because you make noises
They're
and you
pretty
shuffle
little-
things
yeah.
around. Yeah, and he turned to me at one point and he says, "Hey Wayne, you should write a book about mahjong." And I said, "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard."
Yeah.
And then a couple of months later, here's my book.
Oh wow.
So it's not a book about mahjong. This is a book about Chinese culture, Chinese history, and I put as much of it in here as I could. I so much admire the ancient Chinese culture, the science, the knowledge, the philosophy that went into it. And I try to bring all of that in. Basically, the main two characters are two immortal men, and they go on sort of a road trip around ancient China playing mahjong and taking people's money.
Oh.
But at the same time, you learn about Chinese history.
Yeah.
They go to the Great Wall, and you learn about the emperor. They meet the emperor in his underground subterranean palace with rivers of mercury and a map of China, and it's
So that sounds. Is it? Well, could it be considered futuristic also, or is it really?
well, for its time, I think China was way ahead of the rest
Oh no,
of
but
the world.
but your book sounds a little bit like magical fantasy. Is it? Would you consider
It's
it
a
like
s-
magical fantasy or
A little
two,
bit.
or-
Well, it takes place 2,200 years ago.
okay.
But the Chinese have always believed in immortals.
Yeah, because it sounds sort of timeless.
Yes, I would like to think.
Mm-hmm.
And so I bring in the three main philosophies of China: Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism.
Yeah.
And so in the book, I came up with a little device that I use to educate people, the readers, about that. There's also parts of I Ching and the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah.
So I throw in as much as I can. It's entertaining, but yet you still get a side of education.
Well, that's one of the things
with
I
it.
love so much about historical fiction, and it's one of the things we talk about a lot here is just the line, between how do you communicate and represent history, and you have to make it connect with people to make them want to do more research.
Absolutely. Well, and that's sort of what drew me to my next book, if I can.
Yeah, go.
So one of the things that I put in my bio is that I like to play Gilded Age piano, mostly written by women, black, and gay composers, which is like late 19th, early 20th century. So one afternoon, I was sitting playing a particularly lovely Tchaikovsky waltz, and I thought, what must it have been like to live at this time, to get this music? And so I started doing some research, and I found that the 1890s St. Petersburg was the hub of European excellence in arts.
Yeah.
And it was also a center for same-sex couples, although they wouldn't have called it gay and they wouldn't have called it homosexual at the time.
Yeah.
Those terms didn't really exist at that point, but the same-sex coupling did. And so there were a lot of people who were drawn to people like themselves who were in this area who also were artists
Yeah.
and musicians and ballet dancers and writers. And it's just this amazing time. So I concocted a device that I made up two characters who served the czars. They met in a palace, at the palace, in 1880, became very close, eventually became lovers. And I like to say the backdrop is the tapestry of Russian history, is happening behind them as they're getting to know each other. So you get to know the Tsar a little bit. You get to know St. Petersburg. You get to meet Tchaikovsky and Debussy and a lot of the other thinkers and painters of the day. They go to exhibits, they go to concerts, and they meet all these people because they're close to the Tsar. And
Tsar
so,
Nicholas?
this
The
was
one before
Alexander
Alexander?
II.
Yeah.
Alexander II. So I
Next
was
to last czar?
no third
to last.
third from
Yeah.
the end.
Yeah.
I had thought that I would write a book that takes them from 1880 to 1918 when they get shot with the rest of the royal family. But I got so into it, I had a book just on the first czar. Excuse me. This is 2 years. This book it takes place over the course between 1880 and 1881. So I stopped writing for a while. Unfortunately, Russia is not a very popular subject right now. People don't want to read about Russia, even though this country no longer exists.
Yeah.
It's so different from the Russia today. But again, it's a bad
Well,
rep.
I want to read that one.
Okay. So in this, in doing the research for this, I came across a poet who lived in the early 20th century by the name of Mikhail Kuzmin. And that's where my next chapter picks up. Should I?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So when the story got to the early 20th century, my characters, Boris and Vladimir, would eventually meet Mikhail Kuzmin, and he'd become part of the story. And Kuzmin came to my attention because he wrote a book that was published in 1906 called Wings, Krylia, if you speak Russian. And it was the first published book in Russian that spoke positively of same-sex relationships. And it's sort of basically semi-autobiographical. It takes the story of a young man who is transported to St. Petersburg, meets an older gentleman who is gay, and falls turning it down. Finally, they voted it in, and by that time, the book was out of print.
Yeah.
So I didn't want to lose that story. So I decided to take it upon myself to retell that story. I got a copy of the translation that was done in 1950s Britain, which is not very good, in my opinion. And I also got a hold of the original Russian. So working between the two books and my basic working of Russian, I was able to write a story that is not a translation. I call it a retelling. I took the main character, whose name is Vanya, a young boy who's sent from the middle of nowhere to St. Petersburg to live with some relatives. He's orphaned, and they ship him off. And I tell the story from his point of view. The original story was third person. The narrator talked about everybody. But this book, which I call Vanya Says Go, is told from Vanya's point of view. What was it like to be stranded, riding in this boxcar across Russia, being sent off to St. Petersburg, going to meet these people you do not know, learn that you really hate, but they have a family friend whom you think is a god.
Yeah.
This man who's 15 years older, half English, and is the world.
Yeah.
So it's the story of a teenager who is trying to capture the attention of a man in his early 30s.
Mm-hmm.
So the original book ends rather abruptly.
Yeah.
When they're touring in Italy, and they're in a monastery, and at one point Vanya throws open these shuttered windows, and it's sort of a imagey version of coming out. And that's sort of where the book ends.
Yeah.
And I thought, no, I want more of the story. So I took it upon myself, and I wrote an extra section of the book that takes the two main characters beyond that. They get to know each other. They travel. They go to Alexandria, Egypt. They go to London, England.
Wow.
And then they return to St. Petersburg for the end of the story. So I call it a retelling. And that is important because I did not have much of a creative spirit after the election of 2016,
Oh,
as
right,
many
right.
of us did. And it was very difficult for me to write. And a friend of ours had a reading. She's from Russia, and a book of her short stories was being published in Moscow. And she asked her friends to either bring things they wrote about Russia or their favorite Russian authors. So I came with my book and read an excerpt, and another friend of ours came up afterwards and he said, "Oh, how exciting, you've developed this new genre." And I said, "What?"
So what were some of the authors that, so did lots of people bring Dostoevsky, or
Yeah,
what were...
Pushkin.
And Pushkin?
Yeah, and others were their own writings.
Their own,
Yeah.
okay, because there's, unless you're going into like a real intent, there's like Dostoevsky, there's Tolstoy, I'm wondering, I used to read poetry, so I know, but...
Well, you haven't heard of Kuzma?
No,
Very
I
few
haven't.
people have,
Yeah.
but in Russia, he was very popular in his
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
So this friend says, hey, you've invented this new genre. I said, what? He said, yeah,
What it
retelling.
does sound like, yeah,
You're
definitely.
retelling these stories.
Yeah.
And it just got me started thinking. So I went and I looked, and I thought I could look for the first gay novel in other languages,
Mm-hmm.
not just Russian. So I started with the first gay novel in English, which was written in 1869
Yeah.
under the title Joseph and His Friend, A Pennsylvania Story.
Oh my God.
I know, it's-
Oh wow.
It's quite a mouthful.
Joseph and his friend.
Yes, exactly. So the author was Bayard Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
He was a well-known poet and travelogue writer of his time. And he was good friends with another poet by the name of Fitzgreen Halleck,
Mm-hmm.
who's not as well known now, but he was very popular in the early and mid 19th century in the United States. He worked for John Jacob Astor as his secretary for a while, and had enough of that and retired back to his little hometown in Connecticut, where he spent the rest of his life as a lonely bachelor. And somehow he and Taylor became friends. When Halleck died, Taylor wanted to somehow pay homage to his friend. And so he came up with this story. And it is loosely based on Halleck, but it's not exactly.
Yeah.
But it's written in a very 19th century style.
Yeah.
It's very stilted, very stepped back. The same-sex aspects are behind a curtain,
Yeah,
or there's
I
mist,
see.
So I wanted to bring that out of the shadows. And my version is called Better Angels. And the main character is a young farmer who lives in rural Pennsylvania with his aunt. He's there's always orphans.
Yeah.
And he lives with his maiden aunt.
Yeah.
And he is going to be married, but on a train ride, there's an accident, and he meets someone who becomes his lover. And I thought, this story is just a little too white for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to bring some diversity into the story. So it takes place just after the American Civil War. And I thought, let's go for it. I made his love interest, an African American man
Mm-hmm.
who was a free black man
Yeah.
who had gone to university, had a degree,
Yeah.
was on his way to go to a site as an engineer. He was working with a railroad company. And the two of them met, became friends, and then they became more than friends. And not being of the African American heritage myself, I did not want to have any cultural misappropriation.
Yeah, yeah.
So I have a very good friend, Awan Mance, who's a professor of English at Mills College in Oakland, who also likes the 19th century. And before I started writing, I asked her, I said, I'm going to do this book and I'd like to do this. Could you give me some helpful suggestions?
Yeah.
So she said what not to say, what to say, and how to sort of handle situations, which I did.
Well, that's a whole big issue that happens now. There's now screeners for young adult books, and a couple books have been yanked from publication because the screeners feel that they're not culturally appropriate. So yeah,
that's
tricky.
That's
very
why
tricky.
I went through these lengths.
Yeah.
And when I was finished, I had her read it again to say, did I get it right? And she said yes.
Yeah.
So I feel good that I was able to capture
yeah.
the spirit and not do any misappropriation.
Yeah, but it's a tricky line too. Believe me, I am rabidly against appropriation, but you need to do. I think the first responsibility is to your creative voice, and so I feel like people need to not. You need to follow. I think people can get stopped too, and you also need to be able to take risks too. So I think sometimes it can prevent people from taking risks. Also, and so and it's a tricky line.
Well, that's a good point, because the whole field of retelling is about taking somebody's
Exactly.
work and adding to it or changing it slightly as an homage.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to destroy. It says right on the jacket, retelling of Bayard Taylor's, and it has the name of the book. I'm not trying to steal it. I'm trying to honor his work by taking it a step further.
Yeah.
And taking the main character's sense of feeling other
Yeah.
and making it even more other.
Yeah.
That here he is in the late 19th century, a man loving a man who's African American.
Yeah.
And take the otherness one step farther.
And it's just a hugely complicated thing because, writers make stuff up. And so, I would never want somebody to feel like, okay, I can't make up this character because I'm not them. So, it's very tricky. It's a big responsibility.
Well, the other big thing for me is that this character and his sister are basically the heroes of the book.
Yeah.
They're the ones that fix the situations.
Yeah.
They're the ones that figure out the mysteries. They're the ones that solve the problems. And that's the part I really like.
Yeah.
Because so many times it's the other way around.
Well, yeah.
There's some problem and the white man steps in and fixes everything.
Yeah.
And in this way, it's kind of the other way. The white people screw up, and it's the black folk who come and say, I'm going to fix this.
Yeah.
And so I kind of like that turn on things.
Yeah, it's really tricky because you got to be able to make stuff up, and that's such an interesting thing that comes up with film about representation, and that's why isn't I understand the logic very well. Look, okay, why are straight people playing gay people? I understand that logic, but also it is a part. We don't just it's a fascinating issue.
Yeah.
It really is.
Right, and I think of films like Black Panther.
Yeah.
Where one of the most important problem solvers in the movie, aside from the main character's sister, who's the inventive one and comes up with all these wonderful gadgets, is the British guy.
Yeah.
He's helped solve some of the stuff, and I kind of had a reaction to that. It's like, why wasn't it all people from Wakanda saving themselves? Why did the white man have to come in?
Did it seem that way to you, Rizzo?
I see what he's saying. I didn't trip too hard off
Okay.
it, but I get what you're saying.
It's like it seems a little bit like oh, we got to bring the white people in to save the
I
day.
see what he's
And
saying,
it's
'cause
like,
they did it a lot.
no. Wakanda's got vibranium. It's all.
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of that one movie. What was that movie with, what's his name? Where he was the last samurai. It was the last samurai.
Oh, The Last Samurai, where Tom Cruise
That
played the
it
last.
kind of was that,
Oh,
that kind of a deal
yeah,
there, you know?
yeah, right.
There's all these
the white
people-
guy
Yeah.
comes in. The
And
cavalry.
he's the main samurai.
Yeah, it's like,
it's just weird,
Yeah,
you know. But
Yeah,
it is what it is. As
Right.
they say.
yeah. Well, that is interesting. I mean, Wakanda of all
Well,
places. Yeah.
I think it was Madiba who said African solutions for African problems.
Yeah.
And Nelson Mandela. And that's sort of
Madiba is also correct.
right, but not many people know that.
Yeah.
It's
yeah.
just
Yeah. Hey, audience. Hey, James. Hey, James. What up, James? Hey, Don.
Oh,
Don
hey, Don.
Osborne.
Happy birthday, Don.
Yeah, happy birthday, Don Osborne. Don Osborne is another fascinating person that
Yes.
should come on the radio.
Well,
Yeah.
if he's lucky.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I have one more book to talk
Sure.
about. And in doing more research, I found the first English language gay novel, which was written in 1823 by a fellow named Francis Latham. He's a Scottish Gothic writer who lived at the end of the 18th century and into the early 19th century. Was very popular in his day. Back at a time where there was no movies or television, people used books as
Yeah.
entertainment.
Yeah.
If they didn't go to the opera at night, they had a book. So books were very popular, especially big books, so you could take months to get through a book. And his books were very large, mostly fantastical. They took place in faraway places with unusual characters, and people were absconded or kidnapped or ransomed, and all these horrible things happened. One of his most famous books is called The Midnight Bell. It takes place in a monastery, and it's a murder mystery with monks and romance. Jane Austen wrote it into one of her books, Northanger Abbey.
Wow.
The main character makes up a list of the 10 dastardly novels. And there it is.
Are you a big Jane Austen fan?
Rick is.
Rick
the
is?
biggest
Oh,
Jane
God.
Austen fan. So there it is, when the list of dastardly novels is Francis Latham's The Midnight Bell. Well, he wrote a couple of things which had gay characters in them. And he lived as an openly gay man himself, but in seclusion.
Yeah.
He lived, he had an estate in Scotland out of town. He had a private life, but he was very wealthy because he wrote all these books that sold very well. And one short story he wrote called The 1 Pound Note had a gay main character, but it was short. And then I found his book Live and Learn, which has an incredibly long subtitle, which I'll skip for the moment. It was written in a serial format. It comprises 4 volumes. It'd probably take months to read it in the original form, which was not easy to get a hold of.
Yeah.
There are fewer than a dozen print copies in the world. It took me nearly a month to locate
Oh, yeah.
a digital
Wow.
copy.
Wow.
It was not easy. I had to call in a few friendships.
Oh, well.
I can't mention any names
Oh.
or universities, but I was able to get digital copies of the 4 volumes and struggled through it because it's so flowery and verbose and
It would be frustrating to read
self-referential.
digitally, too. I mean...
No, I like reading a pad.
Do you?
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. But it's the language in it. He says frequently things like, well, dear reader, at this
I
point
know,
in the
dear
story...
reader,
Yes,
yeah.
The
Oh,
regular
God.
author would do this and take
Yeah.
you here and show you this, but I will not suffer
Isn't
you
it
with this.
well, yeah,
I
yeah.
would prefer to do this.
It's so wild. But I think sometimes when you just need to get your mind into a different frame to read stuff like that.
Yes, so I took that out.
Yeah.
The story is
Good
from the
call.
point of view of the main character,
Yeah.
who's a young man living in rural England, another yet orphaned boy.
Classic.
They're all orphans.
Yeah.
And he befriends a young fellow, and well, it's a very long story, let's just say. Anyway, my version is called Fortune's Lot, And if you can tell, it's an old snakes and ladders board that I used as the backdrop of the cover, because it is very much that. People rise up and then they slide back, and then they climb up and they slide back. It's an unusual story in that there are actually two villains, so that's kind of fun. And it's a romp through early 19th century London at times.
Always fun.
And I had a lot of fun with that. And one of the things that I added to the book, there was a subculture of homosexual men in London starting in the 17th century, generally referred to as mollies.
Yeah.
And they congregated at coffee houses and tea houses where the proprietor enjoyed the company of such men and would allow them to come in and socialize, or they'd have a back room. And then sometimes they would hire halls and they would put on galas or rituals.
Yeah.
And they would have a marriage ritual, and they had a birthing ritual, and they had all kinds of rituals. So I wrote into this book a ritual that the main character happens to oversee one night. And that's what I usually do at readings, is I read the scene of him witnessing this fake marriage and fake birth.
Wow.
So that's in there somewhere.
Wow. Very, very cool. So we're almost ready for a break. Do you have any more? Do you have any shout outs? And so we want everybody to know you can. Okay, we talked about where Wayne's books are available. Anything else you want to tell our audience?
I could talk about my next book.
Your next, yeah, do.
Again, back to Britain. For those of you who happen to watch Victoria on Masterpiece, at the end of the second season, a young African woman is brought to the Queen as a gift. And Victoria says, we cannot receive people as gifts, but we can receive them as guests. And this young woman spends time at Windsor Palace with Queen Victoria and her family. And I thought, what a wonderful, interesting thing. What would it have been like to have come from a different climate and different culture and be plopped into British royalty? So I did some digging and came up with lots of stories have been written about this woman who was christened Sarah Forbes Bonetta. Forbes was the name of the captain British Royal Navy captain who rescued her from a king in Dahomey in around 1850. And Bonetta was the name of his ship. And he just chose the name Sarah. So her birth name was Aina. She was part of the Igbo tribe of Yoruba in what's now Nigeria.
Yeah.
And so she went to live with the Queen's family. And so I wanted to tell the story to young women who still might fancy themselves as a princess, to see what it is to be a princess from outside.
Yeah.
And so I tell her story from her. It's her as an adult sitting at her desk. As an adult, she's a teacher at a school in Freetown, Sierra Leone. She goes back to Africa. And so I have her writing her story to young people. And once again, my good friend who helped me with Better Angels is my mentor and guide. Also my illustrator. I couldn't think of anyone I would want to illustrate the book.
This one's going to be cool.
Because I'm sort of aiming for the 8 to 10 range.
Oh, how cool.
So a couple of illustrations here and there are nice.
Yeah.
And Awan Mance is the illustrator, and I've seen the pen and ink drawings, and they're magnificent. I can't wait to get this book out. So.
Do you know when it's coming? Does it have a release date?
I wanted it out this month for Black History Month. So we're a little behind schedule.
Yeah.
But soon.
Cool.
Yeah, and that's going to be called Princess Aina, Queen Victoria's African Godchild.
Wow. Oh my God. That's so timely too, you know, because there's the Victoria on
PBS,
Netflix
yeah.
and we are gonna